Hi, everyone. Welcome to the VR panel. My name is Dr. Diane Grimala. I'm at Simon Fraser University in Canada. So if you get on the I-5 and you drive north 1,300 miles, dead north, you'll end up in my backyard. I'd like to thank Dr. Gold for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be on the same panel as my esteemed colleagues. You're really lucky to have such a great bunch in Los Angeles. And this webinar will enable me to feel like a Californian again, if only for the next few minutes. So I'm starting the panel as something of an outlier. I have degrees in design and computer science. I started programming as a way to fund my undergraduate education in 1979. I worked at Apple Computer in the early days before it became one of the Frightful Five. And I started conducting research in VR back in its early days in 1991. VR is kind of like creating an indie film. It takes a lot of experts to get it right and many kinds of expertise. Mine is computer science and design, but also I bring the lived experience of having chronic pain. And I'm really lucky to work with some of Canada's best experts in pain medicine, pain research, and neuroscience. My work is characterized by a really strong patient-centered approach. So basically they live in my lab, or used to before the pandemic. And at the same time, I would kind of encamp in pain clinics. So I have a very tight relationship with patients and health experts, but I also include stakeholder groups because I think that's really important for policy and that sort of thing. The way I approach VR for pain is from a biopsycho and social perspective. And so what we look at in my lab isn't just, let's put on a VR headset, see 3D, feel immersed in a altered environment, and have instant pain relief. It's not like that at all. We're dealing with not only chronic pain, but its complexity. So it's sequelae, the kind of biological add-ons that can attend to chronic pain over time. The kind of psychological issues like anxiety and depression, which are quite common. Phobia, which isn't so much a fear of moving as a reluctance to move because you'll never know if it's gonna hurt or if exercise will make you feel better. And also the issues of social isolation and social stigma. Kind of our quixotic quest is really to see, can we discover pain mechanisms by this kind of back door? Who knows? And also because I look at the complexity of chronic pain, my work isn't just about VR itself, but my systems have VR combined with biosensors, pain education components, a tracking dashboard like you would have for Fitbits, that sort of thing. Because it's a long-term problem and it takes kind of daily continuous effort to self-manage and manage with, in partnership with one's healthcare providers. And so we're wondering if VR can help us forge new neural pathways. And the way a VR system with biosensors work, in this case, that's a GSR or EDA sensor on this fellow's fingertip. And as he's listening to a vocal coach doing mindfulness meditation and kind of gliding through this pathway, the fog becomes less and less as he mindfully meditates. So instead of seeing a graph or that sort of thing, the environment or the weather changes and the birds sound more 3D, the sun comes out and it just feels, you kind of feel more present. So just to make sure I'm clear here, none of this is off the shelf stuff, but it's the result of 29 years of building and testing and building and testing and conducting clinical trials and we have a theoretical basis. So what I'd like to talk about is kind of the awesomeness of VR. So immersive VR is continuously demonstrated since the 1990s how useful it is. It's a really compelling, perceptually and sensorially engaging medium that has been used for psychological treatments as a form of rehabilitation and as a non-pharmacological analgesic, or if you will. But it's not a drug. And that's important because I think it provides us with opportunities, but also a whole lot of challenges. These are some of my virtual environments. I have 17 titles that address the different aspects of chronic pain. And this is just a quick snapshot. So it kind of looks like a game, right? But one of the reasons that's problematic is patients find that the obvious game metaphor, and especially calling their VR therapeutic approach a video game, it really trivializes their condition. It denigrates their lived reality. And remember that most patients have, on average, lived for 5 to 10 years through this odyssey where their family physician doesn't believe that they're in pain. No one can find kind of a biomarkers that might explain their ongoing pain. So that kind of social stigma is really deep, and calling VR a game, even if it has game-like components and is engaging or fun, that's okay, but trivializing it by calling it a game isn't so good. And also there's this notion that patients can just go and buy VR gear and a video game from Steam and not rely on their healthcare professionals. Obviously not, but I think the opportunity here is that VR can be a really excellent way to expand capacity. And I think it's especially useful for long-term use for things like chronic conditions, because it's engaging and because it really increases patients' adherence to treatments ranging from chronic pain to other chronic conditions. And because I think the prevalence of chronic pain is 1 in 5 people in industrialized countries, by conservative estimates here, suffer from chronic pain. So that puts a huge burden on our healthcare systems. And it's really impossible for specialized healthcare, multidisciplinary pain clinics to kind of cope with the sheer numbers. So I think VR could be a really great way to expand capacity in partnership with patients' healthcare professionals. So what I'll briefly show you is a glimpse into the kind of research I do. These are 2 recent VR studies. And if you'd like to read more about it, it's in Frontiers in Neurology, a recent issue. And there are more than 2 studies, but time is short and you'll probably get bored. So this is from my PhD candidate Shin Tong's dissertation work. She's defending in 2 months. And one of I think the issues that having VR not as a pharmaceutical, but as a media form that has therapeutic benefit, one of the issues is where do you publish this stuff? If it takes a diversity of expertise, how do you get the information to computer scientists and the technical people, to the healthcare professionals and health researchers, to the neuroscientists? It's a problem. So for all the PubMed kind of publications, there's a current issue, 2 of them. One of them is for all the titles that have VR in them, I would say this is getting better, but at least 1/10 of them aren't really about VR. They're using video games, so it's not immersive. And the other issue is that there's very, very little information about the actual technology and what patients see, what they hear, and what they do in VR. So if you go back to thinking about medications, you really wouldn't see any kind of research paper on a pharmaceutical that didn't have the chemical composition, right? Or an idea about how it worked. So what we found in a recent systematic review, for example, on 720 papers about VR and fMRI studies to see if there are brain changes that persist, is that of the 720 papers, 8 actually were met our inclusion criteria, and more than 88% of the participants in these studies, which were about VR and chronic pain, used healthy controls. So that's a problem too, because chronic pain isn't just a symptom. It's a systemic dysfunction, and it plays out in different ways, whether you have phantom limb pain or fibromyalgia or complex regional pain syndrome and that sort of thing. So when you're looking at studies like these, you should see a description about how do you know it worked? How many participants? In this case, there were 18. And here again, and I think one of the reasons that there aren't as many chronic pain patients in these studies as you'd expect is because you have to start somewhere. And it's not an easy thing to study chronic pain patients longitudinally. It's easier to get healthy patients. And so she started with 18 healthy patients. And what I have in red here is, I think, what we need to answer in these studies. And that is, what's the actual VR technology that the researchers used? In this case, you should see things like this. It's an HTC Vive, that's the kind of VR gear. And there's motion capture equipment and a heat ping stimulation machine. And what do participants see and hear? And this is really, really lacking in much of the literature. So it can be as simple as this. In this case, it was a very, very low polygon, simple room, kind of a box of a scale of a room. And a patient would sit down at a virtual table. In the control condition, they don't have a virtual body that corresponds to their real body. But in one of the groups, they do see a virtual body, but it doesn't move. And in the third group, they see the same virtual body and it moves in sync with their real body in real time. So from this study, the question was, do you need a virtual body? And if you do, does it have any effect on pain? In this case, pain that's induced in healthy patients. Is there any analgesic effect just from having a virtual body? And the answer in prior research was yes. There's some question about, is it because you can visually see a virtual body, or is it because of the movement? And there's kind of confounding ideas about that. So in our study here, both of them just seeing it and having it move related to lower pain ratings among the participants here. So analgesic effect. So then the question becomes, okay, if that works in healthy patients, does it work in chronic pain patients, and the kind of specificity of different kinds of chronic pain? So for phantom limb pain is a type of chronic pain that's caused not only by a limb amputation, but also brachial plexus avulsion injuries, where your arm, you retain your arm, it just doesn't work, or spinal cord injuries. So in this study, it's difficult to find patients to study over time. So this is a small study. It's a case series that had 5 patients, but it was over 10 weeks. So 4 of them had the brachial plexus avulsion. 1 had upper limb amputation, and we use different instruments to see if there were any changes in pain, in mood, embodiment, and kind of did patients learn to move? Was their movement time with tasks improved? And each session was an hour, same equipment. Again, this is really important to have the kind of technology because they differ. And the tasks were to reach for a ball and to throw a ball like a basketball. And each patient had an arm that either was missing or wasn't working. And so when they go to throw the ball with their intact arm, it, like Dr. Ramachandran's work, it mirrors that motion. So it appears to the patient that both of their arms are functioning in reaching for and throwing the ball in VR. So I'll show you quickly this. They're speaking in Mandarin. So basically what the patient is seeing, they feel immersed in that environment that the researcher is looking at. And that's using his intact arm, and his wife is with him. Okay, so there are many kinds of tasks and timings and data we took. This is one example. So with the intact hand, the impaired or mirrored hand, the execution times became faster, and more importantly, there was a decrease in pain over time, so both immediately and over time, and also a decrease in depression specifically. I think also what we often find is the most provocative findings are the ones that we kind of observe anecdotally. So in this case, 3 out of 5 patients told the researcher that he dreamed that his hands and arm were moving again, you know, before the accident, so to speak. And you know how we're told that we know that we're really learning a foreign language when we dream in that language. We're wondering if this isn't some indication that maybe something more important is going on. And so we're pursuing that question. And the question is really, over time, by repeatedly using VR, are there neuroplastic changes that persist? Or even more provocatively, are we forging new neural pathways that can avoid or replace the kind of chronic pain pathways that have been developed? So stay tuned for our forthcoming fMRI scans to find out. Thank you. There's my email address and my website.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grimala. I'd like to turn it now to our next presenter, Dr. Rizzo.
Hi, everyone. Nice way to spend a Saturday afternoon on a beautiful day. Thank you for that, Jeff. But anyway, let me get started here. I've got a few slides to show off here. My presentation today will focus on the concept of the use of virtual reality in clinical settings to focus on trauma or the alleviation of the residual effects of trauma, and leveraging our work with combat-related PTSD and presenting a vision for applications that can address the 4th wave of COVID, the mental health tsunami that we will be experiencing in the near, already going on, but in the near future. So Just real quick, our center is the Institute for Creative Technologies. That's where the work I'll present came from. Our lab is the Medical Virtual Reality Lab, interdisciplinary group that over the years has addressed a wide range of applications in psych, cognitive, motor, and virtual human applications. Just a quick set of videos to show some of the different ways that we've applied VR in these areas, and some of this stuff will be relevant to what we'll be presenting next. So just real quick, you know, when you think about VR applied in mental health and wellness, you got to think about it in terms of simulation technology. So just as an aircraft simulator can test and train piloting ability under a range of controllable conditions, we can test, train, teach, and treat human functioning in simulated environments in VR, now at a very low cost. It's sort of like the ultimate Skinner box. If you are a student of psychology, you'll get that, but basically a controlled stimulus environment that allows us to help people to, in trauma at least, to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories. But as you saw with Diane's work, working in pain management and many other areas where VR has made sense. If you look at the history here in '94, specific phobias with exposure therapies where VR really got its initial clinical traction. This is a short list of the areas where VR has been shown to add value as an assessment treatment or tool for scientific research in those areas. A lot of reasons we apply VR. Very simply, we can expose people to what they fear or what they've been traumatized in a controllable way. We can distract people from painful medical procedures. We can motivate people to do things they might not ordinarily do, whether it's physical rehab or learn strategies for managing chronic pain. We can measure performance while people are in these environments, and we can engage users in content in ways that may go beyond what traditional methodologies support. Now, the focus here will be on some of our work in the area of exposure. So exposure therapy. As I said, it got its clinical traction early on because it made so much sense. It was well matched to the needs of the application. It was sound, it was, you know, grounded in good theory, good cognitive behavioral theory about helping people to acquire extinction learning when they have irrational fears of things, or that have been people that have been traumatized and are now having residual impact from that trauma, what we call PTSD, not normal types of distress that follows a bad event, but a continuing enduring pattern of those types of symptoms over time that just don't go away. I like to say, you know, people with PTSD, think about the, you know, something bad that's happened in your life, how terrible you felt right after and for some time after. But with PTSD, that pain is the same or worse 6 months down the road. And that's what we're trying to get rid of when we treat folks. Now, with the anxiety disorders where all the work really got started, here are some examples of different phobia applications. I particularly like the upper right with the fear of heights, where it pits your fear of heights against your love of kitty cats. And I believe that application can put a little puppy out there too. But basically help a person to repeatedly expose themselves to things that they fear, and with no negative consequence. Eventually those fears diminish if you don't fall off the plank and off the skyscraper. You know, the research is coming in. We can pretty frankly say that mental health probably has the largest scientific literature of any use case for VR. And in the area of anxiety disorders and phobias and PTSD, last year, the Journal of Anxiety Disorders published a series of articles documenting areas where this technology was well matched and showed value. And in that issue, there was also the most up-to-date meta-analysis. And I think basically it's confirmed that, you know, we can look at VR as an effective and equal medium for exposure therapy, go beyond that. It's equivalent or better than best evidence-based approaches in these areas. And I'll stand by that comment if anybody wants to debate it. Now, PTSD, similar approach, graduated exposure. We got involved in this with combat-related PTSD in 2004. at the same time when the problem from Iraq and Afghanistan was being recognized. I'll talk a little bit about the combat stuff and show some data, but then go right into COVID. And in this case, we're going to move into a quick video clip that it was a recent piece that appeared on a CNN program called Tech for Good. This will explain the PTSD work.
Welcome back to Tech for Good, where we shine a spotlight on life-changing technologies and the people whose worlds they transform. Now, 7 to 8% of the U.S. population experience post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, at some point in their lives. Already a very high figure, but for soldiers returning from war, that statistic is believed to be even higher. Here's how technology can help the veteran community.
I literally had not talked about that scenario for 10 plus years. Never thought about it. I avoided thinking about it. This time as we go through, we have a civilian population to worry about, and it's kind of hard for us because we have to judge between the civilian and military. Some of the things that I saw and some things I did just stuck with me.
Retired U.S. Marine Chris Merkel is about to return to war. A decade on from 3 tours in Iraq and 4 in Afghanistan, this time his frontline is a virtual battlefield.
You start to feel like you're there, and then you see, like where I physically saw Iraq, how I remember. In my mind, I could see that guy getting ready to shoot at us, and it's so intense.
This is Bravemind, a virtual reality exposure therapy program designed by psychologist Albert Rizzo to treat various forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. How traumatic is it for a patient to face these painful memories head-on, to relive them through Bravemind?
When you tell people about it initially, they say, why would you make somebody go back and confront these horrific experiences that they had? Well, we do it because the science shows that this is an effective approach, that helping a person to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories, but in a safe place, getting them to talk about things they haven't talked to anybody about, that is the path to healing.
Merkel says his time in service left him in a constant state of hypervigilance, leading to bouts of anger, depression, and insomnia.
People return, they're not a whole person when they return. It's not like a movie, it's not instantaneous, it's not glorious, it's very violent, it's very visceral.
And when traditional therapy failed to help his PTSD, he turned to the VR program to face the very memories he had been avoiding for years.
Contact front ID, left side.
If you activate this fear, this traumatic memory, but nothing bad happens, you're in a safe place with a supportive clinician, eventually that fear or anxiety extinguishes or habituates.
In his lab at the University of Southern California's Institute of Creative Technologies, Rizzo's team has developed 14 combat scenarios, building in the sights, sounds, vibrations, and even the smells of war.
The clinician has a control panel where they can adjust the lighting, the time of day, the number of people, where a bomb goes off, if a plane is flying over. So you can customize the experience moment by moment in real time for helping the person to go back to something that's relevant for them.
The Bravemind team hopes its tech can be used to treat many other instances of PTSD, not only that of returning soldiers, but those suffering trauma from other walks of life.
Certainly, we're going to be facing a wave of mental health challenges, specifically with healthcare providers on the front lines of COVID.
With his VR sessions behind him, Merkel is finding happiness again, volunteering in the veteran community. One of his initiatives, Waves of Valor, teaches returned service members to surf.
They're not thinking about their pain, they're not thinking about their depression, they're not thinking about the war. They just want to do for themselves. And the healing part is actually surprising. It's not veteran to veteran, it's not therapist to veteran, it's community.
The VR just opens up a world of thought because it's a novel, different way of doing things, but it's opening up how people think about how we help people heal and get past trauma and other things.
Bravemind has pretty much saved my life in more ways than one.
So with that said, by the way, that fella, Chris Merkel, he's just completing his PhD, his doctorate in clinical psychology. He really has made great gains since we saw him in treatment a few years back, and is now giving back to the world. Anyway, just real quick run through, not going to bury you with data. First preliminary study showing positive reductions, clinically meaningful and statistically significant reductions in PTSD symptoms pre and post treatment. Another more recent study with intensive treatment spread out over a 3-week period. Every morning you fly to Orlando, you stay in a hotel and go to this center. Every morning you do VR exposure. In the afternoon you do a mix of other types of therapies called trauma management therapy. Good outcomes, low dropout. We have a clinical trial, randomized control trial under review right now. I can't talk too much about it because it's still under review, but the data are quite positive and show a clear superiority for VR when, particularly when you're working with people that also have comorbid depression. So one of the good things about VR is not only that delivering treatment in this format is not just for the efficacy, but it may break down barriers to care. We may be able to put therapy in a form that attracts people to seek help that wouldn't ordinarily do it in a traditional format. And this was borne out in a recent study where randomized control trial, we told people up front what VR and what traditional imaginal exposure involved, but also told them they were going to be randomly assigned to one or the other group. But if they had a choice, what would they pick? Nearly 77% would have chosen VR. So gathering evidence for its support. The next step was to start to expand the work. So we expanded the work from combat related to sexual trauma in the military. We thought we'd have an easy go of it, just build out some of our content from Iraq, in Afghanistan, but we found out from interviews, most sexual trauma in the military is not happening in the trenches of Afghanistan, it's happening around US bases. So we built out a bunch of civilian content, and we partnered with Barbara Rothbaum at Emory University. This is a perpetrator that follows you around. And I also want to note that we're not recreating sexual traumas, we're recreating the context in which these events happen to help a person to begin that process of confrontation and reprocessing. It was a small pilot study, 11 treatment completers. It was really a safety and feasibility trial because people were skeptical that we weren't going to hurt people, and we had to document that. So not only did we not have any critical incidents occur, but we had, again, clinically meaningful and statistically significant findings, even with this small sample. So what about civilian translation beyond military sexual trauma? Of course, the civilian sexual trauma, we're ready to go. We learned a lot from that study, and we want to build out the content a little better for civilian populations. But there's a lot of trauma in the world, and first responders are a definite user group that we want to address. So we've worked with New York City Police on de-escalation training. Like for the bottom right, that fella emulates a person with a mental health problem that is designed to train police officers how to de-escalate a situation with communication rather than force. This is one that we're doing with the LAPD and with the RAND Corporation, similar idea. And this is a foot in the door, basically, to start thinking about treating the mental health challenges that police are suffering from. Now, let's take a look at docs for a minute. You know, prior to COVID, this is one of the highest occupations for suicide. If we look at nurse suicide from published in 2019 from data up until 2014, you know, we see a significant increase in female and male nurse suicides compared to the general population. When you look at, in another recent study, suicide among physicians and other healthcare workers, almost 1.5 to 2 times the suicide rate. There's no doubt it's a stressful profession, a lot of challenges beyond what most people expect. But now add COVID into the mix. A study out of China came out in March actually with frontline healthcare providers in Wuhan, showed elevated levels of depression, anxiety, insomnia, and distress with that population, and with COVID survivors coming out of the gate after, beating the disease, at least for the short run. We're about to be released. They did the PTSD checklist, and out of 714, 96% were at PTSD levels of distress. Now, that doesn't mean they have PTSD. PTSD is not diagnosed until it's an enduring residual set of symptoms over time. Many of these folks will recover and get better and move forward. But there's going to be a large, out of that 96%, I estimate to be a large sample of people that are going to be in need of direct clinical services. Also, military suicide rate since COVID across all branches is up 20% so far. The Army had a spike. Now they're at 30% higher than the previous year. Real challenge there. Quest doing blood analysis of 800,000, almost 900,000 people testing for COVID, also ran with de-identified data other tests of the blood and found 35% increase in non-prescribed fentanyl, 44% increase in heroin since the epidemic. Another big challenge. There's no question that in this fourth wave of COVID, we're going to be facing a significant mental health challenge, not only with the survivors of COVID, but the people on the front line delivering care to the survivors. So we've got a number of projects that we're focusing on. There's one group that just published a study about a week ago. It came out of China, a case series of 3 people for fear of operating in the outside world after having COVID. Positive effects, but very preliminary data, but showing that people are thinking about this. This is a methodology that may have value. So we think that there's no shortage of trauma in the world, and VR can be a useful tool. What we're doing now is we have an online survey of mental health screening questionnaires to try to get some handle on different populations and how they're experiencing the psychological impact of COVID. And our proposed cross-platform wellness support system, where we leverage a lot of the tech that we've created for military purposes. I mean, let's face it, war sucks, but it always drives innovation in mental health, medicine, rehabilitation, and translating that to addressing the needs of COVID survivors, healthcare providers, and anyone. So combination of online healthcare support and professional burnout coaches with intelligent agents that can be interacted privately online. We've got a mobile prototype of what we call Battle Buddy, but it can be easily translated to civilian for daily check-ins for health and wellness, wide variety of things that can be done in this format without it being a nag. And if you look at health and wellness mobile apps, the sad fact is after download, the median usage of these apps is 1 time. So we got to engage people with this content. And I believe virtual human interaction where the character gets to know you, and not only gets to know you a little bit, but can capture content from your Fitbit or your Apple Watch and feedback that information to you and so on. So the pitch is to move it towards civilian apps, in addition to direct PTSD exposure therapy and some between session mindfulness, self-help, wellness, meditation activities that can be done in low cost $300 headsets like the Oculus Quest. So that's the plan, the vision. There's plenty of areas where there are clinical targets that we can address, and hopefully as our funding comes in, we're going to be able to translate our military applications for these civilian purposes. So with that, I'd like to thank Jeff and the whole team at CHLA and various organizations that support this conference for asking me to come and be a part of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Dr. Rizzo. I'd like to introduce our next amazing presenter, Dr. Brandon Birkhead. So whenever you're ready, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Hello, I'm Brandon Birkhead. I'm a project scientist at Cedars-Sinai, and I work exclusively on virtual reality research. And it's great to be here today. Jeff, thank you for the invite. It's been great catching up on everyone's research in the field that I've gotten to know over the last couple of years. So I'm going to share my screen. So what I'm going to talk about today is some qualitative results from a study we've recently completed. And it's around home-based VR pain reduction. And we're still working on the analysis for the quantitative data, but I want to at least share some of the thoughts and some of the interesting findings we find from the qualitative data. So just to give a background, home-based VR, so we've learned a lot about VR, particularly from those who've been working in the field for a long time, and how it can be used for therapy inside with a therapist at hand, so next to you, or maybe in the lab or inside the clinic. This is particularly different in that, so our lab, we essentially are like a FedEx center. So we're mailing these, VR headsets to people's homes, and they're picking them up out of their mailbox, and then they're opening them up, and we're giving them a call and running through the process of how to use a VR headset. So it's definitely a wild west of, for a hospital-based study, or you could have patients from 20 to 85. It's been interesting over the last 2.5 years to engage in this study. And so within this study, what we essentially had was a composite kit, kind of a digital health kit, if you will, for these patients that have musculoskeletal injuries. And so it'd be essentially a virtual reality headset, which a lot of people I hope you all are learning about today from this session, and a TENS unit, particularly one that's good for the low back. Although patients were definitely using it for all different types of places that it can stick to. It has an adhesive pad on there, but it's FDA approved for the lower back, and it's actually over the counter. And then health coaching, that's the little icon here, is for where we essentially call the patients on a weekly basis to kind of go over, help initially with the onboarding process. How do you do this? And then also like goal setting. So, what did you gain from this week? What would you like to learn next? And what would you like to explore next? What did you find helpful? This type of qualitative results. So like Diane said, it's always good to know what is the VR that you're showing. If you don't know what it is, it's a lot like you don't know what the drug is inside the syringe. So there's kind of two different flavors of virtual reality in the pain reduction literature, and the same is true for this kind of multi content type of VR that we were using. So I break things down into two different types: distraction-based VR, which is very common in the acute pain literature. Our colleagues in pediatrics, like Dr. Gold, will use quite a lot for around procedures and whatnot. And then skills-based VR, which we use to give patients skills that they can then use outside the headset for their life, chronic pain, which can be ongoing. And so you want to try to, provide those skills. And so I'll just show just a couple slices here. I don't know if the sound's going to come through. It may not, but essentially it's just, dolphins kind of swimming. Probably one of the most popular videos we have, or VR content we have, is these 360-degree videos where you swim with dolphins. Of the over 3,000 patients that have had VR at Cedars-Sinai, definitely one of the most popular. And then there's skills-based VR. And so with that, even if the sound doesn't come through, it's kind of nice to show the different types of modules. So it's a multi-module, at least once a day session that these patients would go through. So, initially it was kind of 18 modules, kind of grew to 30, over 30, and now over 50 modules, and has deep breathing exercises, pain education, psychoeducation, and relaxation, and a lot of what you might see in a kind of chronic pain curriculum that you would have with the pain psychologist, which is why this was developed actually by an expert pain psychologist. So that's just a little bit on the content. I'm going to keep on going through. So just the population that's involved here, we're talking about patients that have musculoskeletal trauma injuries at our institution, Cedars-Sinai, or at actually one of my alumni, alma maters, I should say, would be Medical College of Wisconsin, and had a pain clinic there. we had a fair amount of chronic pain patients from pain clinics, probably make up the vast majority of the population. As far as usage data, so if you send out a survey 3 times a week on that day, how many times have you used, or did you use VR at all? It was about 57% time, which is, you know, over a 60-day period. That was, you know, yeah, that's what we had, and probably is fairly reasonable given, you know, how much you can consume of VR or Netflix, whatever you're doing, over a 2-month period. And then we had also looked at the number of times they used it a day, which most commonly was once a day. This is a very busy population, but also the program was kind of made to learn something once a day. And then just want to dig into the qualitative data here. So essentially in these calls that we were doing with patients, it would be, you know, asking them about what are their thoughts are on the technology, also on their pain. You know, were there any barriers or were there any facilitators to make this, to have for you to have a session or complete a session, and then try to dig into any specific goals. So if they liked one type, they want to try a new type of module, or they want to, you know, see what another one's like and kind of explore. And so about of those that were in that group, the arm that had VR, there was also a control group. And those that got VR, was about 70% that completed these types of health coaching events, or 69%, I should say, that consented for that. We also asked about VR side effects in these calls. And so we had about a 14% or 11 patients that had any form of VR side effect. And we just asked a general kind of one question, which is kind of, we made a custom, you know, 0 to 10 scale of, you know, did you have VR side effects? If you did, then what was your intensity? And the reason is that, you know, it was only, you know, 11 patients out of 76 or so that had any side effect. Of those, about half had more than a 5 out of 10. The other half had lower than 5 out of 10. And many times we were actually able to desensitize them. So over a course of a couple of calls, patients were able to use this, or they just had a certain amount and they were using it throughout that time period. So there's a minority of those that were actually unable to use it based on their side effects. So just want to talk about the barriers to utilizing, particularly VR. So this is a VR conference. I focused on VR results. If you're interested in TENS units, we can talk about that too. So to talk about barriers for utilizing VR, we'll just kind of, I'll go down through all of them one by one and just showing a graph here. And this is, so we take all the calls that were made, and then we break them down by percent of how many times something came up as a barrier. So 29% of the time, it was related to what you could imagine with new technology, which is technical issues that can happen. And really, probably one of the biggest ones in the early days of the study, going back 2 years ago, it was definitely the phone. So back in the day, we would do phone. Back in the day, 2 years ago, we would do a lot of phone-based VR. But to do that, you have to latch in the phone into the headset. And as you can imagine, you know, this phone might slip out. This phone might not latch right. And you know, we were having to either hot glue that thing in or duct tape that thing in. And yeah, so we had some issues there, which we were glad to hear from our health coaching to do qualitative results, because then, you know, and you're able to make a change. Once the evolution of all-in-one headsets came about, that decreased a lot of the challenges we were seeing. And so there's also challenges with batteries. That batteries would be, so the controller the person would need. So over time, trying to figure out if you even need to use a controller, or, you know, there's also charging of the headset as well, which is another consideration. And then syncing with some of the earlier days, there was also issues with syncing to the controller via Bluetooth, and then some display, more so education about how the screen itself may fall asleep and need to be turned back on or changed. And so yeah, so lots of learnings around that area, but also seeing how that evolved. And this evolution didn't just happen with hardware. This also happens with software. So software can change. Actually, thankfully, it can change. Unlike some of our other forms of modalities. So pharmacology does change, but over a slower time period than I would say software. So, definitely in the beginning, many times this would be where you might only have 18, or in this case, 22 modules. So just to tell you about this chart, modules is like a session. Let's say each one takes around 5 to 15 minutes. And having different skills like we talked about in the other slide. And what we noticed from these calls was that definitely having more and more modules is great. But there's also differences between different patients may have different backgrounds and different preferences. And that will definitely be a challenge or a milestone for VR therapy to kind of have, individualized VR and kind of the VR pharmacy. Definitely kind of a future moonshot for the field, no doubt. But also there was an interesting kind of, there's a blockbuster feature, I would say, that evolved through the development of the software through the study. And that was the ability just to lay flat. So there is a way in a lot of programs you can press a button and then you can be in a different orientation. So most VR programs, you go buy one at Best Buy or honestly, you're probably getting it from Amazon these days. But so let's say you get one, most of the time it's seated. It's made to be in a seated position. If you're going to use some of these headsets that are made for that or standing, but not so many that are made to literally flat. If you have chronic pain, you also probably have some pain in your neck. It's chronic low back pain. Having some amount of weight on the front of your head is going to probably more than who doesn't yet have pain. It could be an issue. And so that was actually a huge thing for people to be able to finish any number of sessions they wanted comfortably either in a lazy boy or on the bed. So bulkiness was an interesting finding that we could then discuss and then educate other patients on once we discovered that. One challenge that never goes away and is always a challenge is work and understandably work and family. So even beyond the challenges that patients face with having chronic pain is just all the other things. So, the family commitments you may have, the work commitment, 2 jobs. And so I think digital health overall, VR, any type of digital intervention does have a challenge ahead of it, which is how do you best integrate into someone's life and how do you best kind of re-engage and fit kind of within a schedule. So within the health coaching, we kind of felt like there was a time and place when we could try to help them figure out when should I do this. And for us, it was actually towards nighttime. And I'll give you one reason right now, and then I'll give you another reason in a few minutes. And one reason is that, so if this thing is still kind of large, it's gotten smaller, but it's still a little large. It's not necessarily something you're going to take to work maybe and just do on your break. So one thing that came up in some of these conversations I had with patients is leaving it by your bed. There's a nightstand there. It's you can't always, my thinking on it is you can't always tell when you're going to eat. You can't always tell when you might be at home, but at some point you're going to fall asleep. so falling asleep and knowing there's kind of a place for this builds maybe a bit of a ritual, maybe a pattern. But honestly, I actually think that seeing things that like what Skip has developed with having kind of a phone-based program is an interesting idea, and I think that actually might be a useful way to integrate, because again, a phone is one of those things you will bring to work and will be with you. So I think that that's an interesting kind of concept. Another one that happened in only about 10% of the calls, but it's quite understandable, is if pain is quite intense at that given time, there are certain situations we have to be quite honest where it may not be a time to do VR, particularly one that's a bit prophylactic or trying to teach, engage. You may have a pain flare that today's not the day, and we need to get back to it at another time. And so that itself, the disease burden itself can be a barrier. So another one is actually if you're getting better. So the other one is that, not that this is a barrier, but again, if you're on these calls, again, some patients are trauma patients, they're healing from their injuries. The great thing is they're healing very quickly. It's almost, I don't know if it's logarithmic, but probably after a surgery or something, say you broke a leg, got it fixation and secured through surgery, then that first week you might have the worst pain. Second week you're going to have less pain. Third week it's much less pain. So over a 2-month period, you're able to see that full cycle to the point where you're on these calls and they don't have pain anymore, which is fantastic. So that's definitely a positive. Another one is facilitators to utilization, and I think of these as during these calls, kind of either what was a motivation for doing it or kind of the benefit from doing it, and that's kind of how the conversation went with patients. So one of them was definitely an interest in guided meditation. So many talk about the challenges of meditation. It wasn't predominantly that. I have to look back to see the data, what percent were actually had said to be regular meditators before this, but many of them felt benefit to breathing, deep breathing, to figuring out that skill and to create that kind of skill set, that habit over time. And so lots of quotes around the benefits of being able to do that. And then there was sleep. Sleep was, I was honestly a little bit surprised by how much this came up, 28% of the time. I was surprised because I guess at first when I heard about sleep, people were saying, oh, I'm falling asleep with the VR headset on. And I was thinking to myself, oh no, they're falling asleep with the VR headset on. The purpose is to watch the VR content. And, but talking more, there was benefits that people were having better quality of sleep, which I relate to a lot of the literature around meditation. Some of the best and kind of a meta-analysis, large studies that you might see on like a Cochrane review is actually quality of sleep is one of the most highest statistically significant benefits or effects of regular meditation. And so this is actually the second reason that I would recommend for those trying to figure out when to do VR is again to do it around bedtime, because there just seemed to be a benefit around bedtime. And so, yeah, it seemed to have a lot of benefit for decreasing stress and anxiety and all the other components that can come on with better sleep. But that was an interesting finding. Was not predetermined to be what the outcome was. These things were what we predetermined to think that would have an impact on. So pain reduction, of course, and then anxiety reduction. So just the emotional components of life and how this tangles together with the chronic pain and the other situations that are going on in patients' lives. I think that there seemed to be a lot of discussion on that. And a few did talk about alternative for opioid, although I would say that was something that a smaller percent did, because you come into the study, a lot of high percent, over 50% already were just off opiates and didn't have nothing to do with opiates. So then there was another percent, a third, that were already on their opiates. That was they were taking it as prescribed. And that's what they felt they wanted to do. There was no need internally for them to change. And then there was another, probably a fourth or so that were in that process of considering if they would like to decrease their opiate use. So I just wanted to show a little bit, outside of this study, which we're going to completely analyze, we also have an upcoming, it's ongoing now. We've been doing an NIH-supported lower back pain randomized controlled trial with skills-based VR, like we talked about, which includes some distraction modules and skills, and then just one that's a VR group that's just distraction. So, we would think this have great benefit for acute pain, but maybe not so much of chronic pain. And then sham VR, which would be kind of like, so we do this in what we call void theater. So this would be a big TV screen where you would have, similar types of content or maybe non-engaging content. And then that would be your sham or your placebo VR, which the field probably needs once we start to go to higher levels and higher number of patients in the study to really garner that data that you need for it to be placebo controlled. So we have that, and we will soon probably have other NIH funded randomized controlled trials coming out for a few other pain conditions. But I can definitely say we have one for lower back pain, which is really exciting. I already have 30 patients in that study. So, and then it'll go up to 360 patients. So, so yeah, I'll leave that for now because I know we have questions later on. So thank you so much. Thank you again, Dr. Gold, and the whole team at USC. This is a great conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burkhead. That was an amazing presentation. And I'd like to introduce our last presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Gold.
It's wonderful to be here in this session. You as an audience have heard from some of the pioneers in VR research. Diane Grimala has often been called the founding mother of VR. Dr. Rizzo has been often recognized as being a pioneer in this field and really pushing our field forward, not only in innovation and clinical applications, but in research. And Brandon, who is newer to the field, has been doing great work at Cedars, and again, also doing clinical driven interventions, but also focused on evidence-based. So, you know, my hat's off to all three of them. It's great to share the session with them. I appreciate that they agreed to collaborate on a Saturday. Skip, I hear you. It's Saturday. I get it. Thanks for being here. So I'm very appreciative of your time and your expertise and knowledge, and look forward to our Q&A at the end of my talk. So I'm going to be speaking specifically around VR and pain for children, specifically around medical procedures, but I'll give a little bit of a background as we move along. Okay, so I have supporters to recognize a number of philanthropic groups and foundations and granting organizations that have participated in funding our VR lab, which is really wonderful. And a recent collaboration with Disney Junior, as you can see behind me, this is Doc Mcstuffins behind me in this virtual background. So we'll talk more about her and that collaboration later. I kind of like this slide because the idea is that VR is going to be decreasing stress and therefore decreasing trauma. And for me, specifically, kids in the hospital setting who go through medical procedures that are routinely scary and painful, if we can decrease their stress response, maybe they'll have a more positive experience going through their medical care. And a lot of the kids that I care for have chronic illnesses. So they're not coming once a year for a blood draw or a surgery. They're coming often 10 times a month. And so if you have to get poked with needles multiple times in the month, that's a very scary experience and can really increase your stress response. It can increase your trauma associated with your medical care, which can then also be a barrier to wanting to return for medical care because you're afraid, you're anxious, and it causes trauma. So the idea that cows can make sweeter, more plentiful milk as a function of gaming in VR is kind of a joke, but kind of a good concept. So what is VR? You've heard it provides 360 video. You've heard about how VR creates this digital environment. Many of us call it a VR experience or a VE, a virtual experience. We talk about it as gaming, adventures, entertainment. It creates a multi-sensory digital experience. You heard Skip talk about how they can pump in smells. They've got rumble pads on the feet to mimic shaking, trembling, say in a Humvee. As well as other digital contents in the real world. You have mixed reality or augmented reality, which I'll speak about at the end of my talk, which is a way that you can integrate digital images in the environment that the person is existing in. So last year, there was 19 innovations identified as being meaningful and significant in healthcare, and virtual reality and augmented reality were some of those innovations. And so we're moving that forward at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, as are other institutions, pediatric institutions across the country. You saw a little bit about where has VR been applied, as again, as Skip mentioned, talking about the issues of exposure, desensitization, habituation, diminishing person's stress response or their symptoms, their trauma symptoms, reducing their pain symptoms, whether it is acute procedural pain or chronic pain. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. In rehabilitation, you can see how gaming can really be a great environment for encouraging children and adults to move and increase range of motion where they may be more guarded or afraid to move as a function of their injury. You can encourage and reinforce movement in a VR experience for rehabilitation. Phobias, anxieties, it's been used in eating disorders, Some great NIH research around substance abuse. They've created environments called virtual crack houses where you can expose a person who has a substance use disorder to certain triggers and experiences and environments that may cause them to want to use. The same around alcohol, the same around tobacco. So again, this environment can trigger these desires and also these negative memories, and then a clinician can work with that patient to help them to what we call diminish their SUDs, their subjective units of distress, over time through exposure. And then my area primarily has been painful medical procedures. This is some of the first work that was done by Dave Patterson, Hunter Hoffman up at University of Washington, where they worked on wound care. I mean, burn and wound care is very painful, and narcotics doesn't usually cover the pain. And so they started augmenting wound care with VR as well as opioids. And in some of their trials, they've had great results demonstrating that patients are able to have less narcotics on board as a function of the VR experience. So again, VR isn't necessarily a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but what it can do is it can augment pain management in certain circumstances. So what is pain? This was a recent definition. It just came out after 40 years. For 40 years, we've had the same definition of pain. You can see the old one and the new one. And I think what's really interesting is that in the old definition, they talk about actual or potential tissue damage, or described in terms of such damage. So kids who have a needle coming at them are already reporting 10 out of 10 pain, right? So it's the perception of potential tissue damage. And you can see that they've modified it a little bit in this most recent, we're talking about resembling that associated with. So again, it's just a slight modification around perception of pain, but an important revision. And I won't read the other subtext, but you can see how there's a lot of factors that contribute to a person's pain response. And pain is a perception. There is not a great measure for pain. It's usually subjective. A person usually tells you how much pain they're having, and that's what you go on. There is not a pain-o-meter where you can know for sure how much pain that person is experiencing. It's really based on subjectivity. And so again, it's been 40 years since we last revised our pain definition. So something in the field that's happened recently is we've shifted from acute pain management and chronic pain management to recognize that there's a spectrum. So really things moving from acute can become chronic. And so this is it's kind of a spectrum of pain. And I think that is a much better representation of what happens. Sometimes injury that seems like it's acute may continue to be recurrent, and then after 3 months or more, it becomes chronic. And the reason why I show you this slide is to demonstrate how pain is super complicated. It is not just perception and the typical on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being no pain, 10 being the worst pain. What's your pain? That's only pain intensity. So we really have to be more thoughtful about looking at psychological input, biomechanical input, biomedical input, looking at genetics, looking at nature, looking at nurture, looking at learning from the family, from the culture, catastrophization, anxiety, depression. There's so many factors that really contribute to our experiences of pain. So it's not so simple. So I always put that up there just to remind you that pain is not simplistic. This came out from the Institute of Medicine demonstrating in 2012. So the numbers have increased over the last 8 years. Chronic pain affects about 100 million American adults, which is more than the total affected by heart disease, cancer, and diabetes combined. Most people wouldn't think that or know that. Pain also costs the nation up to $635 billion each year in medical treatment, as well as lost productivity. So people not going to work, and in kids' situations, not going to school. So adolescent chronic pain costs have been estimated at $19.5 billion in the US and $9.5 billion in the UK. So clearly it's a significant problem. I like to show this, what I term this biopsychosocial spiral, because there are many roads that can lead to pain or disability that can happen from pain. Lonnie Zeltzer, Tanya Palermo, and Gary Walco coined a term, I think it was in the 80s, called pain-associated disability, or PADS. And this is kind of what that reflects. You can have anxiety that can lead to a heightened sense of pain, sensitivity, that can lead to stress, depression, family distress, and hopelessness. So I think the picture tells the story that we can see how anyone, you can enter this spiral at any place and suffer from a chronic pain condition as a result of these other factors. Put out by Bushnell in 2013, both positive and negative thoughts, whether they're emotion or cognitions, or positive or negative thoughts about your pain, can contribute to pain and can have a bidirectional relationship. So, you know, sometimes clinically I'll have a kid come in and say, well, I was at Disneyland and I had all this pain. I mean, I shouldn't have had pain. I was having so much fun. But that kind of input into your system can still, again, stimulate your pain response, even in a happy state. So positive or negative emotions or thoughts. A very common term in chronic pain is catastrophizing. So if a person feels like they stubbed their toe, which then it hurts, and then they can't walk, and then they can't put their sock on, well, they're gonna miss work. And if they miss work, they're not gonna be able to get their salary. If they don't get their salary, they're not gonna be able to pay their bills. And it quickly goes into this catastrophizing negative loop. This happens often and is very difficult for patients with chronic pain to manage. So I just wanted to give a snapshot around pain as we talk about the VR world. Integrative medicine, I always like to reflect this in my work because people don't realize that things like surgery, nutritional medicine, herbal medicine, lifestyle and behavior, et cetera, is all part of the integrative medicine wheel. I think Andrew Weil said it best, one day integrative health or integrative medicine will just be called medicine. I think Deepak Chopra was talking about that today too. It's wholeness, whole person, not necessarily mind or body or soul or spirit, but really pulling them together. So I like this. This wheel seems to demonstrate that well for most people in the healthcare profession. So this is a really old head mount, again, from Hoffman and Patterson up at UW. Some of the first work that was published, again, in wound care. I always like to show that because we've come a long way. Obviously, this was many of thousands of dollars. My first headset was about $50,000, and now they're about $300 off the shelf, and they're much better than they were back then. On a recent search on PubMed, you can see how much activity is happening around virtual reality, around behavioral health in virtual reality, pain, adult pain, pediatric pain, and chronic pain, with a number of studies that span from case studies to randomized controlled trials, exploratory experimental pain paradigms with clinical populations and typically developing populations. So VR has really exploded on the scene and is really starting to gain some traction, especially since there's better hardware now, as you've learned in today's talk, that can deliver interventions. Our first study, which included Dr. Rizzo, was looking at blood draw. This was in the early 2000s. This is our $50,000 headset. We did a randomized control trial and pushed kids into randomized them into no distraction, cartoon, flat screen of the same environment that was in the head-mounted display. So about 100 kids and 25 in each condition. This is what the environment looked like. Rebecca Allen had built this environment. It was pretty much the only thing available off the shelf. So we used it, not a real gripping environment for kids. It was much more psychedelic and dancing and a little bit more hippie than I think kids were used to. They enjoyed it, they used it. And we did have very strong results suggesting that the head-mounted display was superior in decreasing the pain around blood draw than was just a flat screen environment on a computer or a Lilo and Stitch cartoon, which should date this study, or standard of care. So we learned early on that VR, even in an environment that wasn't necessarily child-friendly or was kind of novel to them, seemed to have a good impact. And if you look back here, we used a pass wall. So every kid was visually occluded from the needle procedure. So no kid, no matter what condition you were in, didn't see the needle. They feel it, obviously. They feel the arm preparation, they feel the needle. They could still hear the nurse or the phlebotomist talking to them, but nobody saw the needle. So we were concerned the reviewers would say, oh, well, they just didn't see it. They were occluded. But we controlled for that, and still the head-mounted display was superior. Then a new game came out called Street Luge, which was much more exciting and more fast-paced, and it had a time on it, and it was a race and a finish line, and you felt a lot of rumble in the rumble pad as you're swooshing down this road. And we used this particular environment for IV placement in radiology, and we're able to show that VR was much better at controlling pain associated with needle insertion than was control. The control group had a 4-time increase in their reported pain intensity than did the kids who were in the VR condition. We've also seen VR used for dental work. So nobody loves going to the dentist, as far as I know. And so this has been studied as well to demonstrate that kids using VR during dental procedures and dental cleaning did better in 3 consecutive treatment sessions. We've also seen that used with adults, where scaling and root planing, which is very painful, that they did actually a split mouth design, which I thought was really cool. They did every subject half with VR and half without, so they were their own control, which was kind of interesting. And the control patients had much more pain than movie, and then VR was the superior intervention for that as well. So we've had a lot of collaborations with a number of organizations, as I showed earlier. We've also worked with Applied VR around testing Bear Blast, which is a intervention, a software that they developed that we use for needle pokes. So anytime you do VR research in a hospital setting, you need a big team. So none of this is possible without our team VR. So there's a number of staff that come and work to deliver the interventions. There's been a number of, again, around acute medical procedures. You've seen a lot of work done around wound care, patients with cancer and sickle cell pain, a couple studies there, a growing body of research around routine procedures. And then more recently, again, as Dr. Grimala had pointed out, work in chronic pain. And also Dr. Burkhead talked about how we're looking at these home kits for chronic pain and his recent NIH funded study for lower back pain. So we're starting to move in that direction, which I think is very exciting. We've seen studies done in healthy subjects to show, in experimental conditions, to show increase in pain tolerance and et cetera, hypnosis and biofeedback, augmented through virtual reality, as well as chronic conditions. Recently, we've been involved in, and other groups across the country are using VR to help for procedural prep and MRI so that you can reduce the need for sedation and have a better set of images in MRI to minimize risk for kids being exposed to the neurotoxic chemicals associated with general anesthesia. Again, because a lot of these kids come through for routine MRIs as a function of their illness. So they're getting many appointments where they require general anesthesia. So if we can start reducing that or eliminating that as a function of PrEP and the use of VR for these procedures, including like TNEs and VCUG around endoscopic urological surgeries, then we can again begin exposing patients to less neurotoxicity associated with GA. So that's a good outcome to reduce that. We've done a lot of work around routine procedures for pain management with IV placement. This is what our population at the hospital typically looks like. 50-50 boys and girls, about a 40% Latinx population, and then a number of other Black, Asian, white, and then mixed race population of children, adolescents. Most of our kids for this study came from the infusion center and from radiology, with a few coming from our vascular access team. We were able to demonstrate that both through patient and through caregiver, that they were reporting less anxiety or affective anxiety compared to standard of care around IV placement. So many of you know IV placement can burn and sting. And then pain intensity was the same. We saw VR significantly reduce pain during IV placement per patient and caregiver report. So, in kids' world, we always assess the parents, and we often assess the healthcare provider too. So of course, again, this isn't possible without radiology, the infusion center, the venous access team. So to get studies like this done in a pediatric center requires a lot of collaboration and interdisciplinary work. We also looked at pain and anxiety during venipuncture. So in a new environment with the Oculus VR, Gear VR, we were able to demonstrate that Gear VR versus standard of care. And again, I don't think these are gonna play audio-wise, but that's okay. You can see he's guarding and wincing, and it's not a good experience for him to get his blood drawn. And that's a very tiny butterfly needle, but again, kids' perceived threat or the actual experience of the pain is not good. Here's the other kid. You can watch his face also and see his response. I mean, he's not having it. He's not happy about it either. And so again, The naysayers who say blood draw is not painful, it still is. I'm sure there's not a person in the audience who would raise their hand and say, oh yeah, I love to have my blood drawn. Here's a patient in the Bear Blast, just kind of playing, and the needle goes in, they're still playing, there is no problem. So they ask questions, the patient responds. The great thing about this is that the patient does well and the parent does well, which makes the job easier for the phlebotomist, which is kind of cool too. So it's kind of a triangular effect where everybody's benefiting. This is what Bear Blast looks like, just kind of a playful environment where you kind of launch Nerf balls at the bears, knock them over, and they kind of giggle and laugh, or you hit the masks and they kind of rotate. And this was an environment that we used for all of it. We used one single environment for all of our studies so that we had a standard, I guess we could say software, a standard intervention. Same thing, we were able to demonstrate that caregivers reported less pain, visual pain, color pain, or affective pain. And then we also saw that both patients and caregivers reported less anxiety and facial affective pain. So we can see that we're getting really great effects there in the VR condition. And then also this is CASI, the bottom on the x-axis. CASI is the Child Anxiety Sensitivity Index. And so what we noticed as that went up, that's kind of a physiological response of anxiety, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, et cetera. As that went up in the standard of care group, they reported more anxiety. However, in the VR group, more CASI, more physiological response, they seem to get a better benefit with reducing their anxiety, although it wasn't significant. You can see the interaction. So we were really pleased. You know, customizability of these interventions, like who is VR good for, has yet to be determined. So part of it might be that if you've got more physiological arousal, you might be a better responder to virtual reality as an intervention than a patient who's not as aroused physiologically. So I think we're going to start working down that pathway to figure out who's it best for. That's kind of a good question. Not just do you have less or more symptoms, but who benefits the most. Patient and caregiver feedback, you know, it's a lot of positive comments from patient and caregiver, as well as the phlebotomists. This is it's always good to get PR for the whole field. You know, this isn't just about us at Children's, but it's about the whole field moving forward. So we got some play in Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, which is terrific on our studies. And we've published, myself and Dr. Marr have published in the Journal of Pediatric Psychology, and there's other publications that are up and coming. We also had some local publicity about a kid who went through through a TNG. So you can see we used VR instead of sedation when they went and scoped through the GI tract. Normally this child would be sedated. And this is the same case here. A child that requires sedation means nothing per oral at midnight, then they miss school, the family misses work, et cetera. Everybody misses out on everything. And the child is then exposed also to the general anesthesia. And in this case, there is no anesthesia. So they use the goggles, it replaces the anesthesia, they go right back to school, the family can go back to work, the other children can go to school, whatever the case might be. So clearly eliminating the need for GA, general anesthesia, is a good outcome. VR is not good for everything. So this is a patient going through VCUG where she's being catheterized through her urethra, and that's a very, not only uncomfortable, but it's also very private. So right now she can't see the staff people down between her legs trying to catheterize her. And so she's not having it. And ultimately she wants to take it off, the goggles. Then she watches the catheterization, and then she asks for the goggles to come back on. So typically a kid like this might abort the whole procedure and then have to be rescheduled. So what we learned about VR in VCUG is that it's good for prep and then removal, let the child watch and have some control and mastery over the catheterization, and then they could put the goggles back on, not abort the procedure, go through with it, and then get the results from the procedure. So that's a great outcome. But again, we wouldn't have known that if we didn't study it. So we did study that, and that was a good outcome. So again, working with urology, child life nurses, doctors, it takes a village. We've launched some new studies. We don't have data yet on this, but VR and augmented reality in the ASC, Ambulatory Surgical Center. The goal is to reduce the need for medicines around IV placement and mask induction. and look at other postoperative outcomes like emergence delirium and postoperative pain and quicker hospital discharge. You can see this is the timeline right here, pre-IV survey, IV start, etc. And then we do 3 time points after they wake up in the PACU, the pediatric aftercare unit. You can see here, this is a child going through, this is the Oculus Go. So again, some newer technology. They're playing Bear Blast, and he's getting prepped for an IV. So we're doing serial interventions, which has never been done before. So we're doing a serial intervention around IV placement and then also mask induction. This is a child in AR, so augmented reality, and he's being wheeled into the OR playing a game. Now, often this scene is a kid crying, a parent distressed, the healthcare providers, you know, just wheeling them in to do their job. What's happening right here is that the healthcare providers are talking to him. He's kind of giggling and laughing. He's playing the game. And then when they induce him, when they mask induce him, he just drops the remote control and he's done, and that's it. Now, there's a theory that if a person goes down softly around mask induction, non-agitated, that they wake up the same way. This is called emergence delirium. And so our goal is to get them to go down easier than they do in an agitated state where they might wake up disoriented, crying, sad, screaming, pulling their lines out. So again, there's some really great outcomes associated with that. This is what the augmented reality world looks like, Mighty Mo. This is what they see. And it also has some artificial intelligence built into it. So when you see those little Pac-Man roll up on the screen, they rate their amount of anxiety. How are you feeling right now? And if it's to the left side, the game stays the same. If it's to the right side, then the game becomes more intense. We call it cognitive load. So it gets a little bit more intense so that the child has to play a little bit more harder, which means they're more focused, which means there's a greater cognitive load, which means that they're more attentive to the task and less worried about the procedure. So let's see here. We've also rolled VR into, I'm going to wrap up in a minute. We've also rolled VR into our teen lounge just to allow kids to play for entertainment purposes, not necessarily for pain reduction, because, you know, teenagers in a hospital setting are kind of bored. And so this has been super well received in our teen lounge. And then I'm going to wrap up with the Doc Mcstuffins, but unfortunately the video is not playing. But we did a collaboration with Disney Junior. They're able to play a game pre-operatively. They're doctor for the day. They get to do surgeries on stuffed animals and pull things out of the animated characters' mouths virtually through VR. So it's a wonderful engagement in what we call procedural prep. So the children are able to prep for their surgery by getting engaged in activities that they're scared of. It enables them to master that. Something that child life specialists do all the time in medical play, but we've turned it into this VR experience. And this has recently been distributed across the country with Starlight in about 1,700 Starlight headsets, includes software from Chariot up in Stanford, as well as this Disney Junior game that they're able to play pre-operatively. We had great results. The kids enjoyed playing the game. It helped them relax. It made the hospital less scary. Most of them knew who Doc Mcstuffins was. Here's a great picture of Catherine, who's actually hosting our room right now. So there she is. She's now on screen. The kids enjoyed it. It was fun for them, and they were a lot less scared. So these are great outcomes. Just again, the feasibility, usability data for kids using the Doc Mcstuffins VR. And so we have a paper under review right now in JMIR for peer review publication on this study. So we have to integrate scientifically informed VR digital-based interventions. We have to look at reimbursement cost savings and patient satisfaction as a function of our use of VR. How do we customize and make it intrinsically and extrinsically interesting, rewarding, and provide feedback to patients? How do we incorporate family or multiplayer? That's a great advent that could happen down the road. VR and digital telebehavioral health is great for clinic-based work, homeschool-based work, good for healthcare workers. Like, could you imagine being at work and taking a 10-minute break and doing a mindfulness VR experience and then going back to your work? Would be wonderful. So I think there's ways in which we can integrate this more regularly into our workplace. Future routine procedural interventions for mental wellness, for medical education, for VR and rehab we talked about, and also VR simulation and education. prep for kids going through MRI. We talked about that. And again, trying to increase our focus on chronic pain and VR, I think is going to be the wave of the future. Some people like Dr. Grimala and Burkhead have been doing this already. I really think that's where we need to continue driving. So we've traveled a long way. There's all kinds of great hardware innovations. Software is still a work in progress. And I encourage people to continue collaborating with academics and healthcare and startups. It's the only way that we'll be able to move this field forward is collectively as a community. We can't do it in our silos. We can't do it in ivory tower. Industry can't do it alone. So we really need each other to move this forward. All right. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gold. That was an awesome presentation. I'm very proud to be a research assistant for you. And now we'd like to open it up for Q&A. So I see there's already a couple questions in the chat.
So I think the first question at the top, are there VR programs or research studies for chronic pain currently in Sacramento? This question is asked by Randy Gold, Sacramento, Northern California.
Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure
Okay.
someone has to be working in it though.
Yeah, I usually just tell, I try to introduce people, we get emails like this a fair amount, and so I just try to introduce people to clinicaltrials.gov, and always new trials kind of popping up, and even if it's somewhat similar or close to maybe what you're looking for when you just kind of search for whatever interests for you, plus let's say virtual reality, at the bottom of the page there's a contact number, and researchers are always willing to talk, and maybe there's something they're working on that's coming up, and that person may have the best knowledge for your area.
Stanford University in Northern California is doing VR with pediatric chronic pain. So, okay, terrific.
What about the question up at the top about take home, phase out healthcare provider?
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I guess Diane and I both are working on remote home VR, but I would say in no way would we ever say we would phase out the healthcare provider. There's so much that we can't do. It's really just kind of a tool. Like, it's just another tool for when you're home. There's computers at your home that could be helpful as an extension, and one of them is in your pocket. And then another one is this VR headset. And we're just trying to help with the 98% of your life outside of the little percent that's used inside the hospital. I don't know, Diane, you might have other thoughts.
No, I agree. I've only seen us refer to it as expanding capacity, not replacing.
Probably some of that question might have derived from some of the things I might have shown with the virtual support agents.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to underscore that this is not a replacement for a clinical provider. It's to fill in the gaps where clinical providers may not be accessible, or where the user doesn't want to go talk to a clinician yet. But it's not doing therapy. It's providing access to resources, maybe engaging the user in some kind of self-awareness dialogue, but it's more of a toe in the water. Now, this will be the most contentious issue in the future area of clinical psych, social work, all the healthcare professions. As AI gets better, can we start to supplement or replace good clinical care? And I'm pretty adamant that we need to tread very carefully on this. There's an old saying that everybody accepts in law, and that is somebody gets arrested and they decide they're going to, be their own lawyer. And the saying goes, he who uses himself in a court of law as a lawyer has a fool for a client and a fool for a lawyer. Same thing. Same thing with clinical care. You need a clinician, do a proper diagnosis, develop a treatment plan, monitor the treatment plan. And these elements, certainly we have an access problem. World Health Organization predicts right now there's 450 million people with an active mental health condition right now, of which 66% will never see the inside of a therapy office. So how do we push out care, but make it, break down the walls of traditional care delivery, but still maintain its safety and professionalism and efficacy by way of clinical judgment? So I think we need to be vigilant for this, but certainly I don't think anybody in this panel is promoting wide-scale replacement of clinicians with software.
Yeah, I think it's augmented. I think Skip, we've had this discussion before around physical therapy when we wanted to introduce VR into rehab, and the physical therapists were like, wait a second, like this is our job. What are you doing? And we were like, no, you need to still drive care. This is just a tool, right? VR was going to be a tool for augmenting PT. And we see the same thing in wound care. Like VR can augment narcotics. They can augment narcotics so that the patient gets more pain control, but it's not acting on its own in the absence of professionals who are, prescribing the correct treatment. So I think that's really important. Okay. Diane, did you want to add anything else to that conversation?
No, I'm just agreeing with everyone, and
Cool.
It's rare for me to do so.
Well, you're with like-minded colleagues, right?
Yes.
I think maybe also, as we do home kits, right, the issue of people kind of going rogue, right? So I think it's important probably in standard protocols that when we do send home kits, that a clinician is checking in with that person who has the home kit on a regular basis and is helping them to fine tune that, to sort of answer their questions, maybe upregulate some exercises or downgrade some exercises depending on how the person is responding to it, and really coaching them in a way that still has professional licensed involvement. I think that's really important for home care.
That's actually one of the things we're doing with arthritis patients and their physiotherapists is exactly that. So they check in every 2 weeks to a month, depending where they are, and they get upregulated usually. So they're really personalizing the kind of number of bouts they can do in a day, and augmenting the VR with Fitbits and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's no replacement at all. And the physiotherapists are actually responding really positively to it because the adherence has gone up.
That's great. Yeah, that one trial that they did on dialectic behavior therapy, they demonstrated that when they augmented it with VR, the participants were more regular and showed for all their appointments than the ones who didn't get VR to augment the DBT. So again, it's a tool to assist with, facilitate treatment. Again, like Skip just said too, that people aren't going to find their way into a psychotherapy office for, during this mental health crisis. A lot of them are not going to seek services. So what can we do to augment that versus, this kind of behavioral health activity or something at home with VR. So there's a question about infection control. I know we always wrestle with this one. So you want to go first, Skip?
Oh, I was just going to mention that, we've kind of gotten away over the years by, using a quick alcohol wipe between users on the headset. I think those days are going to be done. I think we've got to start using things, particularly during, certainly during COVID. We're using more advanced methodologies like the Clean Box system, which is a $1,600, $1,800 ultraviolet C-band device where you
there it is. Like it's show and tell. That's awesome. Thanks, Diane.
Yeah. One minute in the Clean Box and 99.9% of any pathogen is alleged to be killed. And I think that's going to be sort of a standard. I know we're outfitting all the VAs that are using Bravemind, the Ptsd app, with these devices.
That's great. That's great.
A white demo here.
Oh yeah.
I love it.
Turns on purple, and when you get done, it turns blue.
Yeah, lights are really great.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to address our problem now during COVID, and then post-COVID, it'll be the same thing. That will become standard practice.
It's not that onerous, all right, there's a little bit of investment, but you can throw the thing in 1 minute and you get it out and feel pretty confident, and you're reducing the hospital's liability as well.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah. And you can do high volume. I mean, with that type of number, you can turn out headsets pretty quick.
Yeah.
And it standardizes it, because back when we were just doing Sandy wipes, how well is someone Sandy wiping? You give them the protocol, but they might just, wax on, wax off a little different than the other person. So we do both. We just do the Sandy wipe still, and we cook it with a UV. But I do like the UV standardized things, so we can do hospitals.
I have a question for you, since we're all on this call together. What are your thoughts about the integration of biosensors and all of the physiological data collecting components that we talk about? I don't know. What are your thoughts about integrating that into VR systems such that it could manipulate environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's that intrinsic and intrinsic reward for the subject to be able to, like biofeedback almost, or neurofeedback through the VR. So what are your
Diane, that's where you, Diane, that was like, I love reading your papers when you're doing the biofeedback paper for chronic pain. That was awesome.
Yeah. For all the virtual environments I've done in the studies and numbers of patients who've run through them, the VR systems with the biofeedback by far are the most effective. There are two things that at least chronic pain patients respond quite well to. One is the biofeedback, because for things like mindfulness, meditation, newbies are, aren't quite sure if what they're attempting is actually affecting any change.
Mm-hmm.
And so by changing the weather in one of my VR systems, that seems to, like, you can see the results of that, and they're very positive. And the second thing is patients respond really well. I'd say maybe as many as 90% or so, kind of hovers around 88, 90%. When patients see the results over time on a dashboard, and especially printed out on a piece of paper, especially the biofeedback data, you can see a moment where it becomes really concrete, and somehow you can tell that the experiences and the disparate parts are all coming together, and it's making sense for that. So
that's great. That's great.
I think, Jeff, you had mentioned it early on about where we were back, God, I hate to say 18 years ago, with the cost of headsets, and, they were really crap by comparison. And now finally the technology's caught up with the vision, and with now, these kinds of biometric sensors built into headsets now are becoming real feasible. In fact, HP is releasing what they call the Omnicept system in the first quarter. So you'll be able to get sensors that are built into the headset that track, of course, eye movement, which is becoming relatively pedestrian, but also pupillary dilation and heart rate. And there's a number of things on their drawing board for other types of signal capture. Now, the good thing for them is they have a really nice SDK that they've released for early developers that really make it so, it kind of takes the onerous nature of not being a psychophysiologist off the table, because the software is actually, quite usable.
Yeah, it's user friendly. That's smart.
So you got everything all slapped together into an integrated unit, and the sky's the limit here. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. And the integration of other wearable sensors.
Yeah, it's so important. I have to sign off because I have to open up our closing ceremony, but you three can stay on to answer questions. I want to appreciate you for taking this time and joining us. Honestly, you guys are great. I've always loved working with you, and you guys are the best, the top. Thanks for being here. I'm going to sign off to open up the closing ceremony, and I hope to speak with you all really soon, okay? Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Next time we have beers right afterwards.
Yes, correct. That would be correct. All right. I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say, as a geek, to me, one of the biggest issues is ease of use, especially for the home care kits.
Yeah. So hard.
It's a staggering issue.
Yeah. We try to do videos. We're doing videos. We have videos. We have phone call. I think we should at some point. We didn't actually put it in any of the protocols yet, but even a Zoom one-on-one. And if we could, I would love to have inside the VR headset kind of an intro that pops in. This would be where, Diane, where you have the ability to kind of create and customize as much as you want. inside the headset, kind of every time you send it off, it gets like an intro before you get too far down the different levels of UI. Kind of like you do when you get a new Oculus, but I agree. It's still a learning curve. We have not yet cracked that yet.
It's going to up that technical game for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's better. I mean, it definitely. I mean, when we started with phone-based VR and we were sending that home, I was like, we hot glued it. I hot glued the port so that it didn't slide off the charger.
It's really funny.
Yeah.
I hope you have photos of that.
You know what? I'm gonna go find that old unit. I'm gonna take some pictures. Yeah.
Yeah. If anybody wants to start up a VR museum, please get in touch with me. My office is just a pig pile of old headsets and computers and stuff like that. And I don't have the heart to throw them out anymore, so if anybody wants to start.
Those early Sony gloves, cyber gloves.
Remember those? Yeah. Walter had one of those. Yeah.
Atari days.
Yes.
All right. Do we have any questions before we degenerate into old home week here? Back when I was a kid, I had a 20 megabyte hard drive.
Thank you guys so much for taking the time to answer everyone's questions. I learned so much personally. I am such a fan of all of your work, and